In this lesson, we're going to see how the Bourbons ruled triumphant over Louisiana through the classical Bourbon period, and then the movement of populism in Louisiana, followed by Murphy J. Foster, a watershed governor in Louisiana. We'll look at rural life in Louisiana, and then a massacre in Thibodaux, the appearance of rice, and then one of the most interesting stories in all of Louisiana history and New Orleans history, Who Killa the Chief? And then the watershed moment down at the Press Street railway station. The classical Bourbon period lasted from 1881 until 1888. During this period, Samuel D. McHenry, a rather weak and passive governor, became governor on Wiltz's death. There was a great deal of Democratic backlash and skullduggery because McHenry allowed Wiltz to exercise the power of the governor. Allowed Burke to exercise the power of the governor. The election of 1888, there was a backlash among some factions of the Democratic Party. They nominated a resurgent Nichols to the governorship. Funny thing about Samuel T.U. Nichols is that any time the election took place, he always managed to discard his very nice suit and his nice prosthetic arm and put on his tattered old Confederate uniform and pin his sleeve up. That's very good politics. Nichols took on Henry Clay Warmoth in the election, and McHenry, in order to get himself something in the following administration, threatened a fair count of the votes, which would have given Warmoth the governorship again. Nichols then promised to appoint McHenry to the Supreme Court, and therefore a fair count was scrapped, and Nichols was made governor yet again. Edward Burke's rule in Louisiana came to an end when an audit discovered that he had embezzled $3 million in taxpayer revenue. This is in the 1880s. $3 million was $3 million back then. Burke then fled to London. Then he moved to Honduras, where he ended up a wealthy planter. Now, the lottery continued, and the convict lease system continued. But now they were under, shall we say, a more scrutinous eye in Louisiana. Now let's look at the populists. What is populism? Populism is something that you're actually seeing enacted today by the current inhabitant of the White House. He's using populist rhetoric quite often. It's an association of poor whites and rural blacks back in the 1880s. It's highly critical of capitalism, especially the banks and the railroads, which seem to be the pinnacle of capitalism. There was a great deal of hostility to elites, to cities, and to gold. That means that those who adhered to the gold standard, limiting the money supply. The Populist Party in Louisiana was anti-lottery in sentiment, and it was a smaller part of the merging Farmers Union in the Texas State Alliance. Now, the Democrats responded to this third party growth in Louisiana by having Nichols appoint T.S. Adams, a populist, as Secretary of Agriculture. And what they did was they took away the secret ballot and put out an open ballot, which forced many to vote for the Democratic ticket despite their alliance leanings, their populist leanings. In 1892, the Supreme Court ruled that the lottery could not use the mail. And in the election of 1892, Murphy J. Foster was elected governor. The lottery then moved operations to Honduras, where, of course, lived Edward Burke. There have only been two members of one family to serve as governors of Louisiana, and that is Murphy James Foster and Murphy James Foster Jr., better known as Mike Foster, who was Murphy's grandson. Murphy Foster was born in Franklin, Louisiana, and was an ally of Nichols. Murphy Foster is the governor who oversaw the codification of Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement in Louisiana. He ended the convict lease system in Louisiana, regulated the railroads, and then when his term as governor ended, he moved into the U.S. Senate. Later, he served as customs collector under President Woodrow Wilson, which was a highly lucrative job. Rural life in Louisiana at the turn of the century was extremely difficult, both for poor whites and blacks. And remember, there were as many white sharecroppers as there were black sharecroppers. Most of these farmers were small farmers, and they adhered to the one-crop system, sugar or cotton. This leads to chronic and endless debt. Crop liens were one step above slavery, where literally you were turning over almost all of your crop to the owner of the land, the master of the plantation. Poor blacks had it the worst, and there you see a black sharecropper in a sugar field. Notice the poverty in the look of the man. Despite the hardship, tenant farmers chose sharecropping to keep separate from whites. But of course, there were moments when things got out of hand. In Thibodaux, Louisiana, the Knights of Labor attempted to organize a union for sugar workers. The sugar workers then went on strike on All Saints' Day, 1887. And when an early freeze threatened to destroy the crop, Samuel McHenry, a sugar planter himself, ordered in the militia. On November the 22nd, 1887, white gunmen massacred the mostly black strikers and hid some of the bodies in the swamp. This broke the back of the attempt to form a sugar union. No further union activities would happen until the 1950s. Using the state militia to crush unions is a very, very tried and true tactic by those in power. In 1885, Seaman Knapp, who was a Quaker farmer from the North, one of the founders of the famous 4-H organization, was contracted by an English firm to grow rice in the southwest Louisiana prairies. The flatness and the marshiness of the land was very conducive to rice. He then encouraged northern farmers to move south, and by 1900, Louisiana produced half of the nation's rice. You also see towns in southwest Louisiana like Iowa, Louisiana, named after the states from which some of these people came, and Utah, which is misspelled in southwest Louisiana. And there you see the rice mill. You can actually see this rice mill from the interstate as you're heading probably between Crowley and Lake Charles. In 1890, an international incident took place in New Orleans, and it almost led the United States and the nation of Italy to go to war against each other. It all centered around the murder of a police chief by the name of David Hennessy, a quintessential Irish urban police officer. David Hennessy apprehended his first criminals as a teenager. He made detective at age 20. He arrested Giuseppe Esposito in 1881. He was tried for and acquitted of the murder of New Orleans Chief of Detectives Thomas Devereaux. He claimed self-defense. It was probably an argument over a promotion. He was named police superintendent of New Orleans under Mayor Joseph Shakespeare. Now, what you're about to see and read about is the murder of a police chief. However, it's actually part of a larger movement in the city by white elites to seize control of the lucrative riverfront and, shall we say, relegate the immigrants to second-tier status. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The immigrants in New Orleans in the 1880s and the 1890s were the Italians. The immigration demographic had shifted after 1870, moving from Northern Europe to Southern Europe, and New Orleans was the second leading port of entry for Italian immigrants. Most of these Italians were numerous, hardworking, abiding by the law Italians, but they brought with them or it was brought with them the specter of organized crime, the Black Hand of the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra. And Italian families had a tendency to engage in, shall we say, vendettas. And there was a feud between the Provenzano family and the Mentranga family. And Decatur Street came to be known as Vendetta Row. So we come to the murder of Hennessy. Hennessy, an Irish cop and now the chief of police at only 32 years of age, begins to crack down on crime and lawlessness. On October the 15th, 1890, near the Superdome, Hennessy was shot and killed. In his dying breath, he seemed to implicate the Italians before he died. Immediately, the Times Democrat, Edward Burke's old newspaper and a favorite of the Bourbons, and the Daily Picayune blamed quote-unquote Dagos for the murder. The demographic of immigration in the 1880s and 1890s had shifted from Northern Europe to Southern Europe, which meant Italy, Greece, and even the Middle East. The Italians in New Orleans were quite numerous because New Orleans was the second largest port of entry for Italian immigrants, and the large majority of these immigrants were decent, hardworking, law-abiding people. But they brought with them the specter of what was known as organized crime, the Black Hand of the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra. And there was also a feud between the Provenzano and the Mentranga families because in Italy, families handled things very, very medieval still. And Decatur Street became known as Vendetta Row, which is where the fights and the shootings would happen. Well, we come to the murder of Hennessy. Hennessy, spurred on by many of the whites in the city, cracked down on what was known as crime and lawlessness to many. On October the 15th, 1890, he was shot near Poydras Street, around where the Superdome is now. In his dying breath, he seemed to implicate the Italians before he died, and immediately the Times Democrat and the Daily Picayune, which were engines of white supremacy in New Orleans, blamed the, quote, Dagos, unquote, for the murder. And this, of course, whipped up a great deal of popular frenzy against the Italians in New Orleans. A massive sweep of the French Quarter, which is where the Italians had been living and working in the French marketplaces, netted 11 men arrested and tried. They were brought to court, put on trial, and they were all acquitted due to lack of evidence. But an orchestrated lynch mob stormed Orleans Parish Prison. One of the men in the lynch mob was a future governor of Louisiana by the name of John M. Parker. All 11 men were killed in their cells, as well as several other Italians. One of the men in the jail actually used the bodies of dead comrades to shield himself from the mob. A riot then ensued throughout the city, injuring more Italians. A grand jury in New Orleans found no evidence of mafia activity in the city. They returned no indictments against the mob leaders. As a result of this incident, Italy suspended all diplomatic relations with the United States. Pope Leo XIII threatened to put New Orleans under an interdict, which meant all Catholic churches would be closed and the people would not be allowed to access the sacraments. Another police chief at the time, the police chief of the city of New York, opined that, killing a few Dagos every now and then was not really a bad thing. That police chief's name was Theodore Roosevelt. Eventually, the families of the murdered men were given some compensation. In the Bywater section of New Orleans, as you go down St. Claude Avenue, you will cross the railroad tracks at Press Street. You'll turn right and go down to the river, and there you'll see a little reconstructed railway station that's been turned into shops and everything. That is the Press Street Railway Station. And there, in 1892, Homer Adolphe Plessy, a French-speaking Creole whose grandparents were from Haiti, who was a shoemaker, laborer, clerk, and insurance agent, and classified as only 1/8 black, sat in the whites-only car of the East Louisiana and Covington Railroad. He announced himself as black and was arrested. He was challenging the Separate Rail Car Act of 1890 that required equal but separate train car accommodations, and the Citizens Committee of New Orleans recruited Plessy to challenge the law. And they hired a private detective with arrest powers to take Plessy off of the train in order that Plessy not be killed by a riot or a mob, or the police would say, oh, he was shot trying to escape, quote unquote. Plessy is then brought before Orleans Parish Criminal District Judge John Howard Ferguson, a Yankee from Massachusetts who moved to New Orleans in 1865. Ferguson ruled that the separate car law was constitutional. There are many people that say that Ferguson actually ruled with the notion that this case would go to the Supreme Court. Rather than rule against the law, he wanted to see the Supreme Court strike the law down. This case, of course, went to the Supreme Court. Plessy appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court. The Louisiana Supreme Court ruled the law constitutional. Plessy then appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States through what is called a writ of error, and this became the famous case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which Justice Henry Billings Brown delivered the majority opinion, stating that the law was constitutional and that the nation could follow a policy of separate but equal.